like we've learned so much in the last several years about changing the knowledge and skills of individuals, about changing retail environments, about changing policies. And yet there's still so much we need to do to be able to address the prevalence of food-related health problems. And I think particularly understanding how changes at those 3 or 4 levels work together, as several panelists noted. I think it's been easier to study one thing at a time, but in the real world, a lot of things happen at the same time. And so we really need to understand how those things fit together. The question I'm going to put on my list for the panel is, we heard a lot about one half of the food problems facing New York City, which is diet-related diseases and obesity. But I wonder if people could comment a little on the other food problem we face, which is food insecurity and hunger, and particularly how those two sides of our food problems fit together, and what's the research evidence we need to be able to address those. And now we'll take, as I said, 4 or 5 questions from you all, and then I'll turn it back to the panelists. So, some questions, and if you can be as disciplined as our panel in keeping your questions or comments short, that would be great.
Just a quick question. Someone mentioned that people, is the mic coming around? Sorry.
Yes.
The mic over here. Sorry, I forgot who mentioned, but someone mentioned that people express preference in food deserts for farmers markets over supermarkets, and I was wondering if we were able to also isolate the reasons why. Is it because, you know, it's an experience in addition to just being able to access fruits and vegetables? Thank you.
Thanks. No, I think we're going to get a few and then give you a chance. So if you can remember these questions as we hear a few.
I just had a follow-up in terms of that, in terms of FRESH and the zoning incentives, the economic development incentives. What are other type of policy incentives that could accommodate some of those needs and wants?
Hi, I had 2 quick questions. One is, when you were talking about marketing, and especially marketing to youth, I think one of the huge ways that happens now is through mobile phone apps from companies like Coca-Cola and other beverage companies. So I was wondering if there had been any discussions about using that connection to kind of gather information or create incentives for changing behavior. And the other thought that I had was that in your allusion to HIV and AIDS, a lot of work that happened that changed behavior was initially grassroots street organizing, and I'm just wondering if any of the foundations and academics have thought about that model as well for being in communities.
A few more questions.
Along those same lines around the marketing, I noticed the Department of Health ads around the soda and the survey or the focus groups you did with people when you showed the ads, and you got a very reaction that said it would reduce my consumption of beverages. But I'm wondering that, and also the choice that Brian, the signage that you guys used with less healthy, that worked versus saying healthy, right? So both of those are ads that make you go, or messages that are about this is not good. I just want to just talk about that a little bit, and eventually we'll hear more about if those ads worked. I know they worked in the focus groups, but is it working overall?
I was curious in regards to moving forward how it would be best, or whether or not it would be best, to continue engaging with the food industry and to be able to promote these positive policy changes. Because I know that there was, I believe it was Susan who highlighted that there was some engagement with the food industry around the salt reduction, and whether or not there are any other initiatives that you are working along with the food industry.
So why don't we hear from the panelists, and then we'll do another round of questions. you want to.
Oh, sure. So that was a lot of great questions to come at. And I think the thing that I thought of, and from the grassroots perspective and some of the other ones, is how important it really is to combine together education on all levels with these policy changes. And just to touch on a couple of things that were not part of what I talked about here, but we did a project, we work with Harlem RBI, which is in East Harlem, and obviously there's a lot of great food stuff going on there. And with the kids that go to their summer camp, just showing them where they could find farmers markets, where they could find green carts in the neighborhood, and they got so excited. It was as if we were, bringing in the best thing, that we were showing them pictures of these stores in their neighborhood and telling them, shop there with their families, tell their families, and then we were telling the families. So I think that's a great bringing together. And another thing was several years ago when we were doing one of our curriculum in schools, as they were learning about this stuff, a 6th grade girl raised her hand, and she really was excited about what she was learning, and she said my favorite quote, which was, if people on the street knew half of what we now know, they would make different choices. So I think that shows how the more that people can learn and bring up the grassroots, the more that we can bring this together.
So I wanted to answer maybe 2 of the 4 questions that I thought were relevant, just for the interest of time. So one was, are there other opportunities to work with the food industry? One other thing that we're seeing through our work with Shop Healthy is, as we are in more and more stores, retailers are supplied by distributors, and those distributors are asking us and coming to us and saying, well, what are the things that you're recommending in the stores? Because we're going to do a better job of stocking those things. We've also seen that with our food standards, as we are in city agencies and then are in more and more of other places. So for example, hospitals, the distributors that supply both of these places are one and the same. And so these distributors are now thinking through how they can highlight some of their healthier products. And so that's something that we've been working with some distributors on, and how to highlight healthier products higher up the supply chain so that we can have wider impact and wider reach, and has been one opportunity. And then on the question on the ads and how do we know if they're working, I think the biggest indication overall is if you look at the trends in our sugary drink consumption, which I showed, they're decreasing. And although it's hard to parse out what are all the different contributors to that, I think that is a sign that shows that the messaging has been effective and has been working. And certainly we've seen that through these focus groups, through online panel testing that we've seen, and then certainly there's that broad data that you can see across the entire city that shows that decline, which is important. So I'll pass it on.
Well, there's 2 questions that I can help address. The question on the apps, the state governor actually is going to be doing a technology week in December, and we just funded this grant to bring in this group called Health 2.0, which is based out in Silicon Valley. And what they do is bring together tech gurus and health experts to figure out how do we use existing data sets and create apps that would help improve and promote healthy behaviors, right? Now, the problem, of course, is that I personally think that the market is saturated with some of these apps. So the question is, what's specific for New York and New York City that can be developed through this conversation with these app developers and the folks that actually gather this data and have this information available. So that's to come. That's going to happen in December. It's a 3 to 6 month, it's called a Health Innovation Challenge, and there's cash prizes to these app developers, and they're judged by a panel of health folks and tech folks that will then decide which one would be the most responsive to what they think the population would need. So more to come on that. On the question of advocacy and grassroots organizing, I think a lot has happened through the city's investment in schools. There's about 125 schools that have all these programs to engage children and families. And I think it's those types of initiatives that do garner up understanding and education and knowledge. I'm not a big fan of it, only because I feel like people do understand that they need to eat healthy. The question is do they have readily accessible foods available to them? So it's a fine line to walk. I get it needs to get people excited and motivated, but it's based on a history of living in environments that haven't necessarily made those accessible, healthy options available.
So I'll hit two quick points. I think one particularly about marketing, and I think you can think of marketing in a couple different ways. You can think of the kind of marketing that Susan and the Department of Health has done on anti-sugary beverage stuff, but I think you can also think of marketing more generally that the food industry does all the time. And I actually think that is an area where we could have a lot more attention. I think that kind of research evidence about marketing influencing kids is just really overwhelming, and more overwhelming than I think a lot of the food policy evidence is. And so if we could think creatively about how cities or states, not waiting for the national movement, could do something on that, I think that would be really influential and really helpful. And I think that as you see any sort of small ticking away from television advertising, you're seeing double and tripling up on some of these ads and mobile stuff. The second point about the food industry and engaging with or working with the food industry, it's become a seemingly perennial debate within the food policy and food policy research community. Should we talk to them? Should we not? Should we, ban them from every engagement activity? Should we take their money? And I think that it's an important set of discussions, and I think it's probably got more airplay than it deserves, and I think the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. I think that talking to them is fine. I think taking their money probably isn't, so that I think how we strike that balance is a hard one, but I think it's not a completely kind of either-or statement there.
Actually, I'm going to answer a question that Susan and Brian had, and I'll answer a question from the panel. So we've been collecting data from the Columbia Children's Center on where parents are shopping for their food. And these families all live in the Bronx and northern Manhattan. And what we're finding is that, and these are areas that have been designated as high needs for supermarkets. And what we're finding is about 55 to 60% of the families are shopping at supermarkets, despite the fact that in theory they're underserved by supermarkets. And secondly, we're finding about 35 or 30% of the families are shopping at club stores, so like Sam's Clubs. And only about 10% of the population are not shopping at either of those two venues. So this issue of shopping at a club warehouse store is completely understudied in the food environment literature. I mean, what is the impact of only having the option to buy like a 30-pound bag of onions, right? Or the 24-pack of ramen noodles. And so this is an issue that's completely understudied, but it's highly prevalent as a shopping pattern, is going to a Sam's Club store to buy a huge bulk of food and then fill in shopping maybe at the corner store during the week when you run out of milk, but you have this huge quantity bulk thing that was purchased. So this is an issue that we're trying to address in the children's studies to figure out what is the impact of club store shopping on diets in the kids in our families? And also, what is the time impact of, there's a lot of travel time being engaged in by these families to get to supermarkets and club stores. And what is that overall impact on family life, but also on engagement between the parents and the child and things like this. On the issue of farmers markets, we studied, we did qualitative and quantitative work on food preferences amongst Hispanic immigrants living in northern Manhattan and the Bronx, and basically just open-ended interviews, hour-long transcribed interviews of where would you like to buy food and why do you have a preference for buying food? And the resounding response was that these immigrant families did not trust the quality or nutritional value of produce and meat in supermarkets. They would much more prefer to get food directly from a farmer, from a farmer's market. The salient themes that came out of this were essentially organic, locavore, slow food. All of their descriptions about their needs for food matched these very high-income concepts that you see in Whole Food, but these are all families with children in Head Start. And then when we looked at dietary patterns across about 350 families from the same population, what we see is that access to a supermarket had zero impact on fruit and vegetable consumption and zero impact on meat consumption. But proximity to a farmer's market or proximity to a slaughterhouse where you could go and say, no, I want that chicken right there, that's the one I want. That was significantly associated with meat consumption, and farmers markets were significantly associated with fruit and vegetable consumption. And that paper is online. It's Park and colleagues. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Great. I wanted to just add a few thoughts about the discussion around the food industry and sort of second what many people said. I think we've really understudied the food industry, and we need a lot more behavior, a lot more information on the behavior. We know much more about the behavior of eaters than we do about the people who produce and market and distribute food. And given what we understand about its influence, and really an understanding at each level, from the retail to the distributor to the marketers and the national companies. And I think that sort of relates to May's question about how to work with the food industry. It seems many people have been making decisions on that based on ideology, and I think it would be great to have evidence under what circumstances should we work with them and what circumstances not. I don't think it's a moral question. I think it's a very practical question. From my familiarity with the international literature, the sort of voluntary codes that big food companies, multinational food companies, have been well studied, and the general, my read of the literature is they've not been very effective in changing behavior or changing diet. And so there would be some skepticism about promoting voluntary codes as a successful strategy for changing food supply or diet. But I think we need similar empirical investigations at the retail level and at the city level. So let's